For my presentation, I decided to look at the World Bank's involvement in international development in Bangladesh. This is a topic I've written about before in this and other classes. It just interests me. There's lots of pros and cons to the effects of globalization and international development in Southeast Asia. Beyond that, I think it's relevant to us as consumers. A lot of the clothes we buy are made in the textile industry there. So I'll start off with some context. The World Bank has been involved in Bangladesh development since 1972. That's basically immediately after it became independent from Pakistan. Since then, the World Bank has lent over $16 billion to complete projects there. Um, the situation for Bangladeshis is improving. Since 1992, 15 million Bangladeshis have moved out of poverty. There are still millions of people there in poverty. Millions more are out of poverty but are in a precarious situation. If there's a disaster or something, then they could be plunged right back into poverty. So this is a country where the World Bank basically has its work cut out for it in terms of development. There's a lot of work to be done with infrastructure, with the ease of doing business there, and we'll get into that next. So these are the four stated goals of the World Bank in Bangladesh and their investments efforts there. Accelerated growth is exactly what it sounds like. The World Bank would like to see higher levels of growth happen more quickly there. A main way of doing that is through infrastructure investment, both through loaning out money and in convincing private partners to do the same. Beyond that, they also want to see a more conducive business environment, more regional cooperation, and more exports. The World Bank is also trying to do this growth sustainably. Bangladesh is extremely densely populated. It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world. It's also right on the coast, and a lot of its land is at or near sea level. So that means it's pretty vulnerable to climate change and the rise in the sea levels there. So the World Bank's looking at stuff like water resource management, agricultural adaptation, environmental protections, and being prepared for disasters, especially in the more populated cities. In terms of inclusive growth, there are still about 47 million people still in poverty in Bangladesh, and the World Bank definitely tries to make the case that it is promoting growth for everyone, not just for one segment of society. So it says it wants to promote different social services like education, healthcare, nutrition services, as well as social assistance to the less fortunate sectors of Bangladeshi society. And finally, in terms of stronger government, the World Bank basically lobbies the Bangladeshi government to have business-friendly regulations and practices. It also has an interest in combating corruption, which is seen as being a negative for business growth, as well as supporting transparency and the delivery of the kinds of social services previously mentioned. Now, the biggest contradiction between these goals is that of accelerated growth and sustainable growth, especially for a country like Bangladesh. Developing countries today are some of the biggest producers of carbon emissions, and the reason for that is that the industry in countries like Bangladesh are not subject to the same kind of pollution protections and standards that we have in the US. Their factories tend to be a lot dirtier, and they also rely on industries that are simply more generate more pollution, heavy manufacturing, resource production, things like that. Further, Bangladesh and a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia continue to rely on dirty sources of power, especially coal. A big percentage of the power produced there is done off of coal, and they're still building new coal power plants today, which is something that the World Bank has actually warned these countries about doing. And this is all in the face of findings that show that Bangladesh is the most climate vulnerable country in the world today in terms of population that could be affected by climate change. If you look at a population map of Bangladesh, a lot of people live in the coastal regions, and those coasts are just a huge series of low-lying river deltas that'll be basically swept away if there's any significant rise in sea levels, which there will be. The World Bank has invested millions of dollars over the last 5 years in efforts to mitigate the damage caused by extreme weather events in Bangladesh, and in October of 2016 it pledged $2 billion in low-interest loans to help protect against climate change there. Bangladesh is particularly vulnerable to hurricane damage and seasonal flooding in its coastal south, along with drought in some of their regions. The World Bank has invested in infrastructure improvements so that roads and bridges don't get washed away during the rainy season. Same goes for power lines, plumbing, all necessary for a functioning economy. It's invested in agricultural adaptation, encouraging farmers to grow crops that are either flood or drought resistant depending on the area. It's loaned money for the strengthening of homes and other structures. Bangladesh actually has frequent building collapses even when there is no weather event happening due to building codes not always being enforced. And it's also invested in food and water security as well as healthcare, which are always critical services, but they're especially important in times of disaster. So to conclude, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, the World Bank really has its work cut out for it in terms of encouraging growth in Bangladesh. But these efforts are greatly complicated by climate change and Bangladeshi industries' desire to accelerate growth at the cost of environmental damage. Going forward, the World Bank will have to find better ways to encourage the development of infrastructure and services that will help mitigate the damage that climate change will cause there, as well as incentivize the accelerated growth of industries and power plants that won't contribute to the acceleration of climate change. If it fails to do these things, then Bangladesh may end up shooting itself in the foot with vast expansion of its economy in the short term, followed by major human and economic disaster in the near future.